depths of history, at the dawn of humanity, there existed a world where the moral rules we know had not yet been written. In that world, survival was above all else. The line between existence and non-existence depended on the success of the next hunt, and sometimes the most dangerous prey was the most familiar. This is the story of the first pioneers who lurked in those shadows and tracked their own kind. This is the narrative of those ancient times when the hunter became the hunted, when human hunted human. The face of Europe was very different from today. Vast steppes, frozen tundras, and sparse forests covered a large part of the continent. This was the early Pleistocene period. It was a time when glaciers slowly advanced from the north, when the climate was in constant flux. The air was sharp and clean but carried a merciless cold. In the mornings, the fog settling over the valleys would cover the earth with a damp blanket, hiding the sun for hours. At night, temperatures would drop dangerously. Even the most sheltered caves would be filled with a frost that penetrated to the bone. This geography was a homeland that showed no tolerance for weakness or unpreparedness. Life was a constant struggle. The massive shadows of mammoth herds and woolly rhinoceroses would appear on the horizon, passing by, shaking the ground. Predators like cave lions, saber-toothed cats, and giant hyenas were the true masters of these lands. Their roars would tear through the silence of the night, instilling fear even in the bravest hearts. These predators occupied the top of the food chain and posed a constant threat. Trees were not as dense and diverse as today. Cold-resistant pines, birches, and junipers clustered along riverbeds or on slopes sheltered from the wind. While these trees provided firewood and materials for simple tools, the vast open terrain was both an advantage and a disadvantage for hunters. There were few places to hide, but it was possible to spot prey from a distance. Rivers ran icy and swift. Their levels changed with the seasons, sometimes overflowing and turning their surroundings into muddy swamps. These rivers were not only sources of water, but also natural barriers that determined the migration routes of animals. Catching animals in those vulnerable moments when they approached water was one of the most effective hunting strategies. This world was defined more by textures than colors. The hardness of frozen ground, the rustling of dry grass, the softness of snow, the rough surface of a rock. Smell was a vital sense. The scent of a distant carcass, the ozone smell that heralded an approaching predator, or the damp earth smell of a water source were signs that needed to be read for survival. It was within this harsh and unforgiving world that a new species had emerged. It possessed neither massive strength nor sharp claws. Its greatest weapons were its intelligence, social bonds, and tool-making ability. This was Europe's first known human inhabitant, Homo Antecessor. For them, these lands were a fortress to be conquered, and death lurked in every corner of this fortress. Survival meant not only hunting but also not being hunted, and this balance was re-established every day. Homo Antecessor, or pioneer human, lived up to its name. They were among the first human species to leave Africa and set foot on Europe's harsh lands. Physically, they were like a bridge between modern humans and more ancient ancestors. Their faces had surprisingly modern features. The protruding brow ridges, while not as prominent as those of Neanderthals, indicated a strong structure. Their cheekbones were somewhat more recessed, and their noses were more pronounced. These features gave them an expression reminiscent of modern humans. However, beneath this modern face lay a more primitive structure. Their skulls were smaller, and their brain volumes were below the average of modern humans. Yet this brain was developed enough to understand their environment, establish complex social relationships, and make the tools necessary for survival. Their height and build were quite robust. Males were slightly shorter than an average modern human, but more muscular. Their bone structure indicated a tough lifestyle, constant movement, and an existence based on physical strength. Their bodies had begun to adapt to the cold climate. Their stocky build helped them retain body heat. While we have no definite information about their skin color or body hair density, it's likely they had a lighter skin tone compared to their African ancestors in Europe's climate, with less intense sun exposure. This could have been an adaptation for their bodies to synthesize vitamin D. When we observe them as a group, a social fabric becomes apparent. They lived in small, tightly knit clans. These groups probably consisted of several families, and their numbers rarely exceeded 20 or 30 individuals. The group size was large enough to provide sufficient strength for hunting and defense, while being small enough not to create excessive pressure on scarce resources. Their communication was probably based on a proto-language consisting of simple sounds, gestures, and facial expressions. It's unknown whether they had a language that could express complex abstract concepts. However, it was certain that they had an effective communication system to coordinate during hunts, report dangers, and strengthen social bonds. There was a hierarchy within the group. The most experienced hunters, the wisest females, and the strongest individuals had more say in decision-making. However, this was based on situational respect rather than absolute leadership. Survival depended on each individual's contribution, and cooperation was more valuable than competition. These people observed their surroundings with deep attention. Their eyes constantly scanned the area, searching for a prey's track, a predator's movement, or the location of an edible plant. Their world was immediate and concrete. The future was the next sunset, or the next storm. The past was the last remembered hunt, or a lost group member. These pioneers were children of a merciless world, and every line on their faces was evidence of this struggle. Most of the day was spent outside the cave in constant motion. Life revolved around two basic activities: finding food and avoiding dangers. With the first light of morning, the group would split in two. A stronger and more experienced hunting team, usually consisting of men, would scatter across the steppes and wooded areas to find the day's prey. Their targets were large herbivores like deer, wild horses, or bison. These hunts not only provided meat, but also offered the opportunity to make tools from bones and simple coverings from hides to protect against the cold. Hunting required patience, silence, and coordination. Hours of tracking, waiting for the animal's weakest moment, and then a sudden planned attack. These attacks usually carried a deadly risk. The horns or kick of a wounded bison could mean the end for a hunter. The rest of the group, usually women, elders, and children, would stay closer to the cave. Their task was no less vital than that of the hunters. They gathered edible plant roots, fruits, nuts, and insects. This gathering activity was an insurance policy that kept the group from starving on days when the hunt failed. They also tried to catch small animals, rabbits, birds, or fish by the riverside. Children participated in these activities from a young age. By watching their elders, they learned which plants were poisonous, which tracks belonged to which animals. This was their school of survival. The cave was a sanctuary, a womb that protected from the freezing cold of night, the sharp teeth of predators, and the fury of storms. The cave entrance was usually chosen to face the direction least affected by the wind. Inside, fire was kept burning constantly. Fire was not just a source of warmth and light, it was also a shield that kept predators away, a tool that made raw meat more digestible, and a social center around which the group gathered. In the evenings, they would gather around the fire and share the day's hunt. These were moments when the group's bonds strengthened, stories were told, and knowledge was transferred. However, cave life was also difficult. Smoke constantly filled the interior, burning eyes and making breathing difficult. There were no hygiene conditions, and diseases could spread easily. An infection or simple fracture could be fatal. Death was a natural part of life. Old age was a rare luxury. Many individuals lost their lives at a young age due to hunting accidents, diseases, or predator attacks. Did the group mourn their dead members? Or was this seen only as a pragmatic loss? Unknown. But the loss of each member was a blow that slightly reduced the group's chances of survival. Days passed in this cycle. Hunting, gathering, sheltering, and surviving. Each sunset was a victory. Each dawn was a new struggle. For these people, life was a completely concrete existence, stripped of abstract concepts. Pain, hunger, fear, and satisfaction were the most basic words in their language. In Homo Antecessor's world, technology consisted of stone. Their knives, axes, and spearheads were made from nature itself, from flint, quartz, or other hard rocks. These tools were a continuation of the oldest stone tool technology known as the Oldowan tradition. Simple, but extremely functional. Making a tool was an art that required attention and skill. Everything began with finding the right stone. Riverbeds or rock slopes were the best sources for these raw materials. The toolmaker would carefully examine a core stone taken in hand, imagining the potential tool within it. Knowing where to strike, at what angle to apply force, was knowledge passed down through generations. Then, using another hard stone as a hammerstone, they would strike controlled blows from the edges of the core, breaking off pieces. Each strike produced a sharp-edged flake. These flakes were tools in themselves. They were scalpel-sharp knives perfect for skinning a deer's hide, separating meat from bone, or cutting a plant's root. The remaining core stone would turn into a chopper used for rougher tasks. These chopping tools were used to break bones to reach the nutritious marrow inside, cut tree branches, or dig into the ground. Tools were not single-use. A dulled edge could be resharpened with a few small strikes. A tool was a valuable possession for its owner. It was not just a piece of stone. It was the key to survival. The simplicity in making these tools should not be misleading. Each piece was designed for a specific purpose. The shape of the tool used to butcher an animal was different from the one used to sharpen a wooden stick. This showed that Homo Antecessor had the ability to plan and think abstractly. They could design an action in advance and produce the tool to carry out that action. These stone tools were like extensions of their bodies. Where their nails and teeth fell short, the sharp edge of stone came into play. This technology gave them the chance to compete with the massive animals around them. They might not be able to kill a mammoth with stones, but a group of hunters could quickly butcher an animal wounded by spears or traps using these sharp flakes and carry the meat to camp. This was a life-or-death race to be completed before predators swarmed the carcass. Tools were not limited to hunting and feeding. Scrapers were used to clean and shape animal hides. These hides functioned as simple coverings that kept them warm on cold nights, or as curtains that made their shelters more protected. Sharpening the tips of wooden sticks enabled them to make simple but effective spears. The language of stone was Homo Antecessor's silent but effective language. Every flake, every broken surface was evidence of their intelligence, skill, and will to survive. These simple stone pieces represented the first steps of humanity's technological evolution, and these steps were among the most important supports that kept them standing on Europe's merciless lands. Homo Antecessor's world was not divided by maps or fences. However, in their minds, there were boundaries just as real and dangerous to cross. These boundaries were drawn with scent, sound, and memory. Each clan had a region where they hunted, gathered, and lived. This was their homeland. They knew every hill, every riverbed, every cave of these lands like the palms of their hands. They had memorized which trees bore fruit when, which paths deer herds used, where the best flint was found. This knowledge was the foundation of their survival and was passed down from generation to generation. They recognized the scent of their own territory. The soil, plants, water, and even the air itself had a distinctive smell. This familiar scent meant safety. However, a foreign scent mixed in with this scent, an anomaly, was a sign of threat. This could be the scent of another predator or, more worryingly, another human group. Boundaries were also protected by sounds. At night, a scream from afar or an unusual sound during the day would put the entire clan on alert. They knew the sound of every living thing in their territory, the howl of the wind, the babble of water. Any dissonant note in this symphony of sounds was a situation that needed careful investigation. The clan also left marks on these boundaries to mark their presence. Simple but effective methods like marks left on certain trees or rocks, broken branches, or the smell of urine would signal to others that these lands were occupied. This was a silent way of saying, "This is our hunting ground, stay away." Encountering another human group was rare, but an extremely tense event. Resources were scarce, and each group had to ensure its own survival. Strangers were an element that disrupted this balance. They were rivals who reduced the animals to be hunted and depleted the plants to be gathered. Therefore, encounters between two groups were generally filled with distrust and hostility. It would start with observation from a distance. Both sides would weigh the other's strength, numbers, and intentions. Most often, the weaker group or the one wanting to avoid conflict would quietly withdraw and go in another direction. However, sometimes, especially during the harsh winter months when resources were very scarce, these boundaries could turn into a conflict zone. A deer herd or a fertile berry patch could trigger a deadly rivalry between two groups. In these moments, other humans were seen not as fellow species, but as an obstacle to survival. These invisible boundaries shaped Homo Antecessor's social and geographical world. In their minds, the world was divided into two: our place and their place. And their place was where danger, the unknown, and potential threat began. This primitive patriotism was a powerful instinct that increased the group's unity and chance of survival. But it also sowed the seeds of interspecies violence. Winter was slowly increasing its power. Days had shortened. The sun's weak rays were no longer enough to warm the ground. Night frost covered the earth with a white frost in the mornings. Animal herds had retreated to more sheltered valleys or to the south. Hard times had begun for the clan. Food stocks in the cave were depleting. Dried meats were gone. The last gathered nuts had been eaten. Each day meant a more difficult struggle than the previous one. Hunters set out before dawn, but usually returned empty-handed at sunset. The distances they traveled had increased, but the tracks they found had decreased. Sometimes they would track a deer or wild horse for days. Just as they approached, when the wind changed direction and the prey caught their scent, it would suddenly disappear from sight. These failures lowered the group's morale, creating a silent tension. The gatherers' work was even harder. The ground was frozen, and extracting nutritious roots had become nearly impossible. Fruit-bearing plants had long since dried up. Only poisonous or tasteless ones remained. Small animals had gone into hibernation or retreated to their dens. Hunger had descended on the clan like a heavy shadow. At night, conversations around the fire had decreased, replaced by stomach rumbling and worried looks. Children's cries were heard more frequently. Weakened elders now struggled to move, spending most of their time wrapped in hides in the cave's most secluded corner. As bodies weakened, minds dulled. Decisions that were normally simple were now harder to make. Small disagreements among hunters grew. Patience was running out. Hunger was like an acid slowly corroding the social fabric. During these periods, even the smallest food crumb was valuable. A bird's nest with frozen eggs found by a hunter, or a few insect larvae wintering under tree bark, meant a small feast for that day. Bones were boiled again and again, trying to extract even the last drop of nutrition. The clan had entered survival mode. To conserve energy, movements had slowed, and all unnecessary activities were avoided. Eyes had sunk, faces had paled. This weakness brought by hunger made them vulnerable not only to disease, but also to predators. A risk they would normally avoid could now become a necessity. Approaching a carcass left by a hyena, or attacking an animal too dangerous to normally hunt, were options brought on by desperation. Hunger also blurred moral boundaries. The survival instinct took precedence over all other thoughts. The clan's most basic rule was to keep the group together and ensure its survival, and this rule could sometimes justify even the most disturbing actions. It was during these long and dark days that a new and dangerous idea began to sprout in the hunters' minds. That other smoke they saw on the horizon, the sign of that other group's existence, was no longer just a competitive element. It appeared as a potential solution, a desperate option that could dispel the shadow of hunger. For several days, a thin smoke had been rising from the top of the hill across the valley. This had not escaped the clan's experienced eyes. At first, they thought it might be a natural fire caused by lightning. However, the smoke had been rising from the same point in a controlled and regular manner for days. This was the sign of a fire, a campfire. Strangers. The clan's two most experienced hunters were sent to scout the situation. They passed through the terrain silently and stealthily, like ghosts. They used every rock, every bush as cover. They constantly kept the wind facing them, preventing their scent from going in that direction. After hours of careful approach, they reached a hill from which they could see the source of the smoke. Below, in a sheltered recess near the river, a small group had set up camp. They were like themselves. The same posture, the same movements, the same primitive clothing. Their number was about 10 or 12 people. A few men were sharpening stone tools by the fire. A few women were tending to children, gathering something from the riverside. For a moment, there was a strange familiarity in this scene. It was like a reflection of their own lives. However, this feeling of familiarity quickly gave way to cold analysis. The observers studied them like a hunter. How many are they? Do they look strong? Do they have weapons? What is the number of children and elders? What could their weak points be? The foreign group appeared smaller and less organized than themselves. A few pieces of meat hanging around their fire showed they had recently had a successful hunt. This created a pang of hunger in the observers' stomachs, while also sparking a spark of jealousy and anger in their minds. While they were well fed, their own clan was dying of hunger. These lands were theirs first. These strangers were taking what was rightfully theirs. The observers lay motionless for hours, recording every detail in their memories. They tried to determine the strangers' routines, whether they left guards, their most vulnerable moments. They noticed that in the early morning hours when hunters returned to camp, most of the group remained defenseless. When they fell asleep around the fire at night could also be an opportunity. As the sun set, the observers retreated with the same silence. When they returned to the cave, they told the rest of the clan what they had seen. Their narration was done more with signs and sounds than words, but the message was clear. There's a group nearby. Their numbers are few, and they have food. This news changed the atmosphere in the cave. The lethargy brought by hunger gave way to tense energy. Eyes were shining, whispers were increasing. These strangers were no longer just a rival. They were a problem, and every problem had a solution. That night, in the firelight, different expressions could be read on faces. Some showed fear, some hesitation, but in the strongest ones, there was a cold and determined expression. That distant smoke was no longer just a sign of presence. It had become a target that needed to be eliminated for the clan's survival. This decision was not made aloud, but the same thought echoed in everyone's mind. And this silent agreement was the beginning of a history to be written in blood. The decision was not made in an instant. An primitive but extremely logical calculation was being made in the clan's mind. This was the merciless mathematics of survival. On one side was the current situation: hunger, bodies weakening with each passing day, decreasing hunting chances, and increasing predator threat. Continuing on this path meant the clan slowly eroding, the weakest, the elderly, and children being lost first, and ultimately the risk of complete extinction. This was a passive death, a slow and painful end left to nature's mercy. On the other side was the option to take action, to attack the foreign group. This option also had its own risks and returns. The risks were clear. The strangers were like themselves. They had weapons. They could fight. A conflict could cause casualties from their own clan as well. The death of one or two experienced hunters would seriously weaken the clan's future hunting capacity. Injuries were equally dangerous. A wound that got infected meant slow but certain death. There was also the risk of failure. If the attack was repelled, not only would energy be wasted, but they would now have a hostile neighbor whose location was known. However, the return seemed worth the risks. First and foremost was food. The strangers' camp probably had several days' worth of meat stock. This would enable the clan to get through the most difficult period, giving them the opportunity to regain strength and wait for better hunting conditions. Second was the elimination of competition. These strangers were using the same hunting grounds, the same water sources. Eliminating them meant all the resources in the region would be theirs alone. This was a long-term survival advantage. The third, the most disturbing but also the most pragmatic, was this: the strangers were not just an obstacle or rival. They too were made of flesh and bone, just like a deer, a wild horse. In the darkest moments of hunger, the concept of kinship lost its meaning. Only prey and predator remained. Hunting a deer was also dangerous. Its powerful kicks and antlers existed, but deer were hunted because they were a food source. These strangers were smarter and more dangerous than deer, but they were also slower and less powerful. They were a walking food source. This thought is horrific to a modern mind. However, in Homo Antecessor's world, morality was overshadowed by the survival instinct. For them, this was not evil or monstrosity. This was logic. No different from a predator killing and eating a rival predator, a law of nature. The clan's leader, the oldest and most experienced hunter, made this calculation in his mind repeatedly. He weighed what they would lose against what they would gain. Before his eyes were children crying from weakness, exhausted elders and clan members who had fallen into despair. Then in his mind, he visualized the other camp's fire and the smell of meat. The decision had been made. The risk would be taken. Because the risk of doing nothing was certain extinction, the risk of taking action at least promised hope. The mathematics of survival always pointed to the most merciless option. The firelight created flickering shadows on the cave walls. The clan sat in silence. The tension that had been hanging in the air since the news brought by the observers had become almost palpable. The issue was no longer whether to attack or not, but when and how to attack. The leader, the most experienced hunter, stood up. His face looked tired and stern in the firelight. He didn't speak. Instead, with a piece of burnt wood in his hand, he drew a simple map in the dust on the cave floor. One line represented the river, one circle the strangers' camp, and another their own cave. Then he called the other hunters to his side. With signs and guttural sounds, he began to explain his plan. The clan had brutal simplicity. The attack would be made just before dawn, at night's darkest and coldest moment. This was the wolf hour, the time when most living things were at the deepest point of sleep, when defenses were at their lowest level. The strangers' fire would likely have weakened and nearly extinguished by that hour. This would help them hide in the darkness. The group would split in two. The main group, consisting of stronger and more experienced hunters led by the leader, would quietly approach the camp following the riverbed. The sound of water would suppress the noise of their footsteps. The other, smaller group would ambush on the slope behind the camp. Their task was to prevent those trying to escape and create confusion during the attack. Targets were also determined. Priority was the foreign group's men. They posed the greatest threat. Once they were neutralized, resistance would largely be broken. During the plan's narration, not a sound was made in the cave. Everyone carefully watched the leader's movements. Women pressed their children tighter to themselves, a mixture of fear and determination readable on their faces. They would not participate in the battle, but the outcome of this battle would determine their and their children's fate. The hunters indicated they understood the plan by nodding or making an approving grunt. There was no fear in their eyes, only cold focus. This was nothing new for them. They would approach a bison herd or a group of wild horses with similar tactics. Only this time their prey was different. The decision was unanimously approved in silence. This was not a democratic vote. It was a common manifestation of the survival instinct. Hunger had erased hesitations, suppressed fear. Only purpose remained, to survive at all costs. That night, no one in the cave slept properly. Everyone was waiting for the approaching dawn, the approaching blood. This was a turning point in Homo Antecessor's history. For the first time, humans had decided to hunt their own kind in a planned and organized manner like a game animal, and this dark decision had put them on an irreversible path. After the decision was made, the lethargy that had been over the clan completely dissipated, replaced by feverish and silent activity. Everyone had a task. The hunters began to prepare their weapons. These weapons were simple but deadly. The most common were wooden spears. Sturdy and straight tree branches were carefully heated over the fire, making them easier to shape. The tips were sharpened by whittling with sharp flint, then hardened again in the fire. This process compressed the wood's fibers, making it almost as hard as bone. These spears were designed not for throwing, but for thrusting in close combat. Others prepared hand axes. These were almond-shaped stones, carved to fit in the palm, with one end pointed or sharp and the other blunt. These tools could be used for both cutting and crushing, multi-purpose weapons. A hunter carefully checked the weight and balance of the stone in his hand, sharpening the edges even more by striking with a smaller hammerstone. Each strike produced a small spark and a sharp clicking sound. This sound echoed inside the cave, like a herald of the approaching violence. The most important preparation was the production of new and sharp flakes. The best flint nodules were selected. The master toolmaker, holding the coarse stone between his knees, struck with great precision, producing scalpel-sharp flakes. These flakes were the deadliest weapons. Small and light, they could easily cut through an animal's or a human's skin, tear muscles and veins. Some were bound to the ends of short sticks with resin and animal sinews, becoming primitive knives or small spearheads. Preparation was not limited to weapons. The hunters painted their faces and bodies with charcoal and dirty soil. This was not just camouflage. This was a transformation. a ritual that transformed them into hunters, into predators. Black and gray lines blurred facial features, giving them a more threatening, less human appearance. This was also psychological preparation. It enabled them to shed their own identities and become part of the group's common and deadly purpose. In silence, everyone knew what they had to do. Movements were habitual and mechanical, sharpening a weapon, tightly binding a hide. These were movements they had done thousands of times. But this time, the meaning in the air was different. Everyone knew what was at the end of this preparation. The women watched this preparation silently, bringing water or food scraps to the hunters. Their role was to stay behind and wait. But the expression on their faces was as determined as the hunters. This battle was being fought for their children's survival. As time approached, the silence in the cave deepened. Only the sound of stones clashing and the crackling of fire could be heard. Each hunter was alone with his weapon, with his thoughts. They were repeatedly visualizing every moment of the attack in their minds. Where would they approach from? Who would they attack first? What would they do in case of a counterattack? This was a way to overcome fear and focus the mind on the task. When the weapons were sharpened and bodies painted, everything was ready. Now all that remained was to wait. To wait for the darkest moment of night, that silent hour when prey is most defenseless. The moon had hidden behind the clouds. Pitch darkness had swallowed the valley. Only the faint light of the stars dimly illuminated the terrain. The attack group left the cave in single file. Their movements resembled the silence and fluidity of a cat pack. Their bare feet made almost no sound on the frozen ground. The leader was in front. Each step was measured and careful. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness and could pick up even the slightest movement like an owl. His ears were alert to the slightest crackle, the breaking of a branch or the rolling of a stone. The group advanced using the shadows of rocks and bushes, avoiding open terrain. The first stage of the plan was to reach the riverbed. The noise of the river would be the most important element to hide their approach. The cold air made their breath visible as small clouds of steam, but no one felt this cold. Their bodies were warmed by adrenaline. Their minds were locked on a single purpose. When they reached the riverbed, they entered the water. The ice-cold water immediately numbed their legs. But this pain did not slow them down. Walking in the water was harder but much quieter. The leader gave signals with his hand, directing the group. Stop, advance, be quiet. These simple commands were instantly understood by everyone through years of shared hunting experience. The other small group had separated from them and started climbing toward the slope. Their job was harder. They needed to take position on the steep and rocky slope while maintaining their silence. Each step had to be carefully planned, because a single rolling stone could ruin the entire plan. The main group continued to advance along the river. The faint glow of the fire from the strangers' camp could now be seen in the distance. This reminded them of their target, increasing their determination. They had also started to smell them. The smell of smoke hanging in the cold air, the smell of burnt meat and foreign bodies. This scent awakened the predator within them. When they got close enough to the camp, the leader gave the stop signal. They hid among the thick bushes on the riverbank. From here, they could clearly see the camp. The fire had almost died out. Only a pile of glowing coals remained. Around it were sleeping figures wrapped in hides. There was no guard. The strangers felt safe. This would be their biggest mistake. The hunters began to wait motionlessly. Their bodies trembled from cold and tension, but they suppressed this trembling with their will. They did not take their eyes off the sleeping figures, assessing each one's position, whether they were a potential threat. This waiting moment was harder than the attack itself. Silence increased tension, planting seeds of doubt in the mind. But the leader's determined stance gave the group confidence. He was waiting for the right moment. That moment when dawn's first faint light began to paint the sky. The moment when night and day merged, when the world was most vulnerable. Time seemed to have slowed. Every heartbeat echoed in their ears like a drum beat. Then the leader slowly stood up. He gripped the spear in his hand. This was the signal. The shadows slipped away from their ambush position and began to silently advance toward the camp. The hunt had begun. When dawn's first gray light began to lick the eastern horizon, the leader made a silent hand signal. At that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Except for the river's monotonous babble and a bird's faint chirping from afar, there was absolute silence. The hunters covered the last few meters by crawling on their bellies with a snake's fluidity. Each had locked onto their predetermined target. The leader's target was the largest-built man sleeping by the fire. He was probably the foreign group's leader. Quickly neutralizing him would break the backbone of resistance. The leader looked at his group one last time. In his eyes shone a cold command. Then he took a deep breath and gave the attack signal with a guttural growl from a single throat. At that moment, silence was suddenly shattered. The hunters burst from the shadows and fell on the sleeping camp like an avalanche. Screams, growls, and the sound of bones breaking tore through the morning's tranquility. The leader lunged at his target. As the foreign man tried to understand what was happening through the haze of sleep, the sharp stone in the leader's hand found his throat. A choked sound emerged, and everything was over. The other hunters had also moved into action at the same moment and with the same merciless efficiency. Spears were thrust, hand axes descended. This was not a battle. This was a massacre. Sleep-dazed victims had almost no chance to defend themselves. Within seconds, all the adult males in the camp had been neutralized. The screams now came from women and children. They had woken in terror, frozen by the scene of blood and violence around them. Some tried to flee, but at that moment the other group that had ambushed on the slope sprang into action. With stones thrown from above and frightening sounds they made, they cut off escape routes. Panicked women and children fled back toward the camp's center. The attackers now advanced on them. The goal was not to eliminate everyone, but to completely destroy the threat and seize resources. Anyone who resisted or posed danger was eliminated with the same ruthlessness. A few women and older children who appeared younger and healthier were set aside. Their fate would be determined later. Perhaps they would be forced to join the clan. The attack ended as suddenly as it began. Within minutes, the once life-filled camp had turned into a field of death. Silence descended on the valley again, except for the crying and moaning of the survivors. The attackers looked around, out of breath. Adrenaline was slowly withdrawing, giving way to cold reality. There was no drunkenness of victory, only satisfaction with the job done and focus on the next step. The leader checked the camp, checking if any of his men were seriously wounded. They were lucky. There were only a few minor scrapes. The element of surprise had worked perfectly. Now the camp was theirs, with everything in it. His eyes fixed on the pieces of meat hanging by the fire. Then on the bodies lying on the ground. This was the price paid for the clan's survival, and they had not hesitated for a moment to pay this price. The sun had now fully risen on the horizon, illuminating the bloody scene. But this light did not bring them warmth or hope. It only once again threw in their faces how merciless the business of survival was. The chaos and noise created by the attack gave way to a strange, almost respectful silence. Except for the muffled sobs of the surviving captives, only the sound of wind could be heard in the camp. The hunters did not celebrate their victory, did not shout, did not make a show of joy. Instead, they began to work methodically and functionally. This was the same routine as after a hunt. The leader gave orders. A few hunters positioned themselves at high points to keep watch around the camp. Although the threat seemed to have been eliminated, they needed to be alert for predators that the scent would attract or for a possible clan member who might return. Others began to carefully examine the camp. Everything the strangers left behind was valuable. Well-crafted stone tools, simple coverings made from animal hide, usable wooden spears. All of these were collected. They especially searched for clues about where the strangers' flint source was located. Perhaps they had found a vein of better quality than the one in their own region. This information could be as valuable as the meat itself. The fire was rekindled. New logs were thrown on the coals that had nearly died out during the attack. The fire's revival was a symbolic demonstration that control of the camp had been completely seized. This was now their fire, their refuge. The captives were gathered together. Their numbers were not many. A few women and a few children under 10 years old huddled together in fear, not taking their eyes off the attackers. They didn't know what would happen to them. The hunters didn't touch them for now. They were a matter to be dealt with later. The group's main focus was on the bodies lying on the ground. This was the most crucial and most cold-blooded part of the process. The hunters approached the corpses. In their eyes was neither regret nor anger. Only pragmatic assessment. They looked at them just as they would look at a hunted deer. Which one is the most nutritious? Whose bones are more suitable for making tools? This moment, for a modern mind, is where humanity ends. However, in their world, this was the inevitable consequence of survival logic. The dead were no longer persons, they were resources, meat, bone, and hide. In a world where nothing could be wasted, these resources were vitally important. This silent and methodical activity continued for hours. As the sun rose in the sky, the camp was slowly transformed. The strangers' traces were being erased. The order of the victors was taking their place. This was nature's most basic law: the strong survive and seize the resources of the weak. Homo Antecessor was applying this law in its most merciless form. For them, this was not moral collapse, but biological necessity. This planned and emotionless activity following the silence clearly revealed how they saw the world. The world was a place governed not by emotions or morality, but by needs and opportunities. And they had mastered playing by this world's rules. The hardest and most delicate part of the work now began. The bodies lying on the ground were carried one by one to the camp's center. This was not a funeral ceremony. This was a butchering activity. The hunters pulled out their sharpest stone flakes. These tools had been used thousands of times to skin a deer's hide or separate a bison's meat from bone. Now they would be used for the same purpose on the bodies of their own kind. The process was conducted with horrific meticulousness. Movements were skilled and mechanical. First, long and smooth strokes were made to cut the skin. The sharp edge of the stone tool left a characteristic mark on the bone, just like a butcher's knife rubbing against bone. These fine scratches were the evidence that archaeologists would find thousands of years later, and that would illuminate this dark event. Joint areas were separated with great care. As arm and leg bones were separated from the body, stone tools were used to cut the ligaments. During this process, tools sometimes struck the edge of the bone, creating small notches. This was another sign of a deliberate dismemberment action. Meat was peeled from bones in large pieces. The flakes used for this process left parallel and shortcut marks on the surface of bones. These marks showed that meat was systematically removed for the purpose of obtaining food. Very different from the marks that random violence or a fight would leave. This was evidence of a planned food processing procedure. The rib cage was broken or cut to reach the ribs. Internal organs were removed. Just as with any hunted animal, no part was wasted. The most shocking action was directed at the skulls. With a strong and blunt stone, a hole was made at the base or sides of the skull to reach the brain. The brain, with its high fat and calorie content, was one of the most valuable food sources. This action most clearly showed that this event was a survival, a feeding action. Very different from ritualistic decapitation or trophy hunting. The goal was purely nutritional. Finally, long arm and leg bones were placed on a large stone anvil and broken open by striking with another hammerstone. The goal was to reach the nutritious marrow inside. This bone marrow was one of the most important sources of fat and protein that enabled survival during times of hunger. The spiral fractures and impact marks on the edges of broken bones revealed the deliberate nature of this action. When this horrific process was completed, only a pile of butchered bones and meat remained. This scene was no different from where a predator had eaten its prey. The difference was that both the predator and the prey were of the same species. These marks on bones were Homo Antecessor's silent confession, a history not written in words, but carved in stone on bone. This was a disturbing story that told how far the struggle for survival could go, how humans could turn into predators against their own kind, and this story would wait underground for thousands of years to be discovered. In the later hours of the day, the camp had been completely cleaned and appropriated. The resources obtained had been made transportable. Meats were wrapped in large pieces of hide or strung on wooden poles. Usable tools, hides, and other materials were grouped for transport. The leader gave the order to prepare for return. The clan's own cave was a day's walk away. They needed to get this valuable spoils to their shelter before predators' attention was drawn and before it spoiled. The load was heavy. Each hunter carried as much meat and material as they could carry. This would be an exhausting journey, but no one complained. They were walking with the assurance of food that would enter their stomachs for the first time in weeks. This gave them superhuman strength. The captives were placed in the middle of the group. Their hands were loosely bound with vines. They were unlikely to escape. They had nowhere to go, no clan to take refuge in. Their fate was now in the hands of the victors. On their faces was a blank expression, created by fear and shock. They had not yet fully comprehended what had happened to them. The journey began in silence. The group was returning the way it came, following the riverbed. This time there was no need to hide. They were no longer the hunter, but the victors carrying their prey. However, they were still alert. The scent of fresh meat they carried could attract predators from kilometers away. As they approached the cave, those left behind noticed them. When the women and elders waiting at the cave entrance saw the hunters returning with full hands, a wave of joy and relief spread. However, this joy gave way to a more complex emotion when they understood what the cargo being carried was. There was no celebration in the cave. This was not like the return of a bison hunt. Everyone knew where this meat came from. There was silent acceptance. Hunger had suppressed moral questioning. Survival was more important than anything else. The incoming meats were immediately carried to a cool corner of the cave. Some were prepared to be cooked over the fire. The other part would be subjected to drying or smoking to preserve it for longer. The captives were seated in a corner of the cave. The clan's other members looked at them with curiosity and distrust. They were both proof of victory and a potential problem. What would be done with them would be decided by the leader. That evening, when they gathered around the fire, the atmosphere was different. Bellies were full, bodies were resting, but there was a weight in the eyes. What they had accomplished had kept them alive, but it had also changed them forever. They were no longer just a group that hunted animals. They were a group that hunted their own kind, and this knowledge had seeped into their souls like the smoke that permeated the cave walls. The return to the cave was not a completion of victory, but of brutal necessity. They had survived for now. But the price of this survival had been facing humanity's darkest instincts. As evening fell, the scent filling the cave was a scent that had not been felt for weeks. The rich, oily aroma of cooking meat, pieces of meat sizzling on flat stones placed over the fire or directly over the coals, were an irresistible invitation for hunger-twisted stomachs. The clan had formed a circle around the fire, silently waiting for the meal to be prepared. Everyone's eyes were on the meat over the fire. This was not just a meal. This was a concrete expression of survival, victory, and power. When the first pieces were cooked, they were taken by the leader and distributed, starting with the eldest. This was a demonstration of hierarchy and respect. Then came the turn of the hunters, women, and finally children. Everyone took their share and began to eat. The first bite was like an explosion. After weeks of hunger, the taste, texture, and warmth of meat revived all the senses. No one was talking. Only the sounds of chewing and swallowing could be heard. This moment was completely primitive and instinctive, no different from a hungry animal eating its prey. The source of the meal was not on anyone's mind at that moment, or if it was in their minds, they were suppressing this thought. The mind was focused on the task of meeting the body's basic need, to be nourished. This was not a ritual. It did not carry symbolic meaning like honoring the spirits of the victims or taking their strength. This was a completely pragmatic action. Meat was meat. Calories were calories. The body needed fuel, and this was the most efficient fuel available. As the feast progressed, the tension over the clan began to gradually dissolve. The feeling of satiety brought with it a sense of relaxation and security. The worried expressions on faces were erased, replaced by a tired but satisfied expression. Even the children, for the first time in weeks, were silently and fully enjoying eating. The captives did not share in this feast. They watched this scene from a dark corner of the cave in horror. Perhaps they understood that their own clan members' meat was being eaten. This realization multiplied their pain and fear. They were not part of this new family. They were spoils. After the meal, bones were thrown aside. However, these would not be thrown away. These bones would later be boiled to extract the last drop of nutrition, then used to make tools or needles. Nothing was wasted. As night progressed, clan members fell asleep with the drowsiness brought by full stomachs. Sleeping in the warmth of the fire, safe and full, was a luxury they hadn't experienced in a long time. No nightmares were seen that night. The mind was occupied with the relief that survival brought. The moral weight of the action, if there was any, was crushed under the comfort of a full stomach and being safe. This feast around the fire was a summary of Homo Antecessor's merciless world. Everything done to survive was legitimate, and the greatest reward of survival was having enough strength to see the sun the next day. Tonight, they had regained that strength. In the most disturbing way, time flowed like a river. Centuries turned into millennia, millennia into tens of thousands of years. Homo Antecessor quietly withdrew from the European stage. Perhaps they succumbed to climate change, or perhaps they gave way to more advanced human species, Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. The caves they lived in filled with soil. Their bones, tools, and traces of their lives were buried under sedimentary layers. Their stories were forgotten. Nearly 1 million years later, in the late 20th century, a group of scientists was excavating in a cave they called Grandolina in the Atapuerca Mountains in northern Spain. This cave, accidentally discovered during railway construction, harbored missing links in human evolution. As the excavation progressed, they reached a layer they called the Aurora stratum. In this layer, they found fossils of a previously unseen human species dating to approximately 800,000 years ago. They named this new species Homo Antecessor, meaning pioneer human. But what they found was not just the bones of a new human species. Among the fossils, they noticed a disturbing pattern. Human bones belonging to at least 11 different individuals were mixed with animal bones in the same layer. Most of these individuals were children and adolescents. What was even more shocking were the marks on these human bones. When scientists examined the bones under a microscope, they came face to face with evidence that left no room for doubt. On the bones were cut marks caused by stone tools. These marks showed that muscles had been stripped from bone. There were notches at joint areas indicating that limbs had been dismembered, and most importantly, the pattern of these marks was exactly the same as the butchering marks on the bones of animals like deer and horses found in the same cave. Long bones had been deliberately broken to reach the marrow inside. There were holes in skulls that had been opened to reach the brain. This was not evidence of war or ritualistic murder. This was the oldest and clearest evidence of systematic cannibalism, nutritional cannibalism. This secret under the ground had been revealed thousands of years later. The fictional event we narrated in our story was the real story told by the bones in Grandolina Cave. Homo Antecessor was not only hunting other animals, but also hunting, butchering, and eating its own kind. This discovery fundamentally shook our understanding of human evolution. Cannibalism began to be seen not just as an exceptional situation resorted to in desperation or a complex ritual, but as a regular survival strategy for some human species. The bones at Grandolina were silent witnesses of the past. Without words, they told how merciless survival could be, how dark and complex the origins of humanity were. Every scratch on those bones was a frozen memory of violence, hunger, and merciless logic once lived. The earth had finally revealed its secret, and this secret was a disturbing truth that required humanity to face its own past. The discovery at Grandolina raised a question in the scientific world. Why? Why did Homo Antecessor eat its own kind? What was the motivation behind this behavior? Several different theories were put forward, and each was an attempt to understand the complexity of this primitive behavior. The simplest and most widely accepted theory is the nutritional cannibalism theory. According to this view, for Homo Antecessor, other humans were just another prey. Especially during harsh winter months when food sources were scarce, a rival human group was seen as both a threat and a potential food source. In this scenario, cannibalism was not a moral dilemma, but a completely pragmatic solution. A human body was a rich source of high-quality protein and fat. Eliminating a rival group both solved an immediate food problem and reduced competition for prey resources in the region in the long term. The fact that the bones at Grandolina belonged particularly to children and young people who were less dangerous and easier prey supports this theory. This could have been part of a strategy to obtain maximum nutritional value with minimum risk. A second theory can be called territorial cannibalism or aggressive cannibalism. According to this view, cannibalism was not just about hunger, it was also about territorial defense and dominance. Homo Antecessor clans may have violently defended their own hunting grounds against other groups. Destroying a group that violated their boundaries and then eating them would send a powerful message to other potential rivals. Stay away from these lands. In this case, cannibalism was a show of force and the ultimate expression of territorial control. Eating their rivals meant destroying them not only physically, but also symbolically. Another less likely theory is ritualistic cannibalism. In this type of cannibalism, a symbolic purpose is pursued, such as taking the power, wisdom, or spirit of the deceased. However, given Homo Antecessor's brain capacity and level of cultural sophistication, it seems unlikely that they possessed such a complex and abstract thought system. Moreover, the evidence at Grandolina shows that bodies were systematically butchered, just like an animal. This points to a butchering operation, rather than a ritual. The use of every part of the body for food suggests the event was practical, rather than symbolic. In conclusion, the strongest evidence supports nutritional and territorial competition theories. Probably these two motivations were intertwined. While hunger triggered an attack, this attack also secured the territory by eliminating a rival group. For Homo Antecessor, this was not an evil action. This was part of survival strategies. In their world, there was a sharp distinction between us and them. We were the clan, the family, those who needed to survive. They were the rival, the threat, and sometimes the prey. This merciless logic may have been one of the adaptations that enabled them to survive for hundreds of thousands of years in Europe's harsh conditions. The answer to the question why was hidden not in modern moral rules, but in evolution's most basic and merciless laws. The discovery of Homo Antecessor made the complex branches of the human evolution tree even more interesting. Where exactly did this pioneer human fit? What was its relationship with other human species? These questions remain at the center of an ongoing debate among scientists. One of the first and most striking theories was that Homo Antecessor might be the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans, Homo sapiens. This theory was based on the surprisingly modern features of Homo Antecessor's face. This modern facial structure could be a precursor to features seen in later human species. According to this scenario, a branch of Homo Antecessor that emerged in Africa evolved into Neanderthals after migrating to Europe, while the branch that remained in Africa paved the way to Homo sapiens. If this is true, it means Homo Antecessor is at one of the most important crossroads in human history. However, there are also views that oppose this theory. Some researchers argue that Homo Antecessor was a side branch that separated from the main trunk of the human evolution tree and eventually became extinct. According to them, these first pioneers who came to Europe may have been eliminated or assimilated by more advanced species that came later, possibly like Homo heidelbergensis. According to this view, the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans is not Homo Antecessor but a later species. More fossil evidence is needed to resolve this debate. However, whatever Homo Antecessor's exact place in the family tree, its importance is undeniable. They were brave explorers who represented one of the first waves of humanity's global dispersal. They had the courage to leave Africa's hot savannas and settle on a cold and dangerous continent where no human had set foot before. This is an incredible adaptation and survival success. Merciless strategies like cannibalism can be seen as part of their efforts to adapt to this new and challenging environment. This behavior was part of their survival toolkit and perhaps enabled their lineage to continue for a while longer. However, evolution is merciless. A species that was once successful can become extinct in the face of changing conditions or stronger rivals. The story of Homo Antecessor also ended this way. After maintaining their existence in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, they were silently erased from the fossil record. They left behind bones and stone tools that kept their secrets underground. They were a forgotten chapter in humanity's story, a species that hunted its own kind, but also explored new worlds, a complex ancestor with both dark and light sides. Their legacy reminds us how diverse and sometimes disturbing the paths of being human have been. They are an overshadowed but undeniable part of our family tree. The story of Homo Antecessor may have ended approximately 800,000 years ago in Spain's cold valleys. However, their legacy continues to echo in the modern human mind like a disturbing reverberation. Their existence causes us to question simple and comforting narratives about what humanity is and where it came from. We generally tend to think of evolution as linear progress from primitive to civilized, from savagery to morality. However, Homo Antecessor shows how winding and dark the paths of this progress have been. They are the earliest evidence that intelligence and tool use were not always used for good or cooperation. The same intelligence could be used to plan the most merciless survival strategies. This situation exposes the duality of human nature, the both creative and destructive potential within us. Homo Antecessor's cannibalism forces us to think about our relationship with our own species. It brings up the question of when the concept we call humanity began. The ability to see another human group as different from us, as them, and to dehumanize them is perhaps one of our species' most dangerous characteristics. This is a mechanism that underlies history's darkest moments, from Homo Antecessor's primitive clan wars to modern times' genocides. Their story also reminds us of the overwhelming power of the survival instinct. Hunger, fear, and the desire to survive can demolish even the most basic moral taboos. This may be a difficult reality for those of us living in the modern world to understand. However, when we understand the merciless conditions our ancestors faced, we can see that their choices were products of desperate logic rather than monstrosity. Homo Antecessor was not a monster. They were a product of their time and their environment. They were a successful species. They spread to a new continent, withstood harsh climate conditions, and maintained their lineage for hundreds of thousands of years. They did this using all the tools at their disposal, and one of these tools was hunting their own kind. The cut marks on their bones are not just evidence of past violence. They are also a reflection of potentials lying in humanity's depths that we generally prefer to ignore. They are the whisper of the shadow within us, of that primitive ancestor who could do anything to survive. This echoing legacy invites us to be humble. It reminds us how thin a membrane our civilization stands on, and how fragile the line separating us from our ancestors' merciless world can be. The story of Homo Antecessor is our story. It is a disturbing, complex, and undeniable part of being human, and thus the pioneer human story is buried in silence among the layers of time. They were neither hero nor monster, just beings living according to the most basic rules of existence. They made merciless choices to survive in a merciless world. Their legacy reaches us as a whisper carved in bones. It reminds us that humanity's dawn may not have been as bright as we thought. This is not a story to be judged, only a past to be understood.